I'm going to walk you through like my process for designing a garden. I like to design it in a 3D software and use actual dimensions of the layout of the land. And so this is our plot 10-9. Not represented with the 3D model is the grading of the land. So this land has a pretty severe slope to it, and that's one thing that I probably should have modeled because it's the only plot that we have with a serious change in the elevations of it. And this plot deals with a lot of flooding from not even heavy rains, just the moderate rains will flood it. And so there is a pretty severe down step to it that affects the beds that I have plotted. And so that was something that I should have modeled but overlooked with this design. I ended up having to redesign this a few times in order to get the flow right for the walk spaces, as well as the accessibility to each of the garden beds and the right design in order to maximize the amount of garden space that I have, because I didn't want to use the total backyard space. I wanted to stay contained within half of it. So that's why I marked the center with the drainage hole. And then I also did setbacks from the back of the property as well as the side so that this garden couldn't be seen from the street view, and so that lawnmowers could pass around the garden comfortably. The first design was modeled after the first garden I designed and built, which was modeled after hugelkultur. So in hugelkultur, you build the layers of the soil. Basically, you start with heavy timbers and logs, and then sticks and branches, and then leaf mulch, and then top layer soil, which are mulch on top of that. So that was the goal. The garden beds would be built from fencing panels. And so I would stack them 3 panels high, and then it would be filled with the raw materials and then covered in the soil and mulch. That was the overall design goal. So the corner bed, the square boxes, those were meant for pollinating areas where I would sow the marigolds or other pollinating flowers. And the front 2 beds were meant for potatoes, seed potatoes, because they needed more depth in order to root out and produce. And then the 6-foot garden beds would be for vegetable produce. What happened with this was I realized I didn't have the access to the raw materials, and the soil would be a heavy expense, and I didn't have the transportation to transport all the materials that I needed to actually build the soil or build the beds for this. The beds were easy. The only expense building the frames was screws. I had the fencing panels already sourced freely. Here I redesigned it to better accommodate the whole idea of saving space. I didn't really need 3-foot walkways because 2 feet or 1.5 feet was enough for a person to walk in between rows, like just rows on the ground, and gather produce. So I kept that mindset and narrowed the design for this. And then this ended up being the actual design that I built with the panels before realizing the difficulties in transportation and sourcing the materials. So then I had to redesign again. SketchUp is a software that I've been using for about 5 years now. I've used it in my architecture classes for design ideas, and I've used it even after architecture school for other personal projects. And I would still say I'm still learning the ropes, but some things are programmed into the system that I really know how to do. This was one of the last designs that I've created for the garden in the series that I've done, and it optimizes the most space for gardening to me because it still is within that marked out location for the garden area, as you can see, and it has the most grow space. And like I said, I had all the materials to do this. The only problem was fill, and so with this one layer system, it would have been easier to fill, but it still would have cost me because I would have imported the dirt. But as you can see, there's space enough to harvest things. There's ample amount of grow space, and the circulation is great. And like I said, this was one of the last designs I did, and so by this point I had already established my grow space and started planting in it, and so you're going to see what that looks like towards the end of the video. But if I had the chance to redesign, I would go with this design. This is the second design that I really came up with for the garden. You see with this one, the front two beds were going to be used for potatoes, so I needed those to be heeled or like taller. So those were the 3 planks. And then the grow space itself, those are one tier, but I didn't like that they were out facing. So that's why in the previous one to this one, I looked at turning them in facing, so the combs are towards like facing the inside. I used the cylindrical markers to note within the square foot gardening method how much of what type of vegetable I would be planting so I can get the number of seeds that I needed to start. With that design, I looked into greenhouses so that I can start overwintering crops as well as storing. I think this will be the final design. The end goal for the P9 allotment is to have all the functions that I need in order to get this allotment up and running off the ground and producing and selling in farmers markets or roadside stands. So I have designed it to, in the future, hold the greenhouse space, and it has the potential to be built up as far as the soil, because that's going to have to happen. I can't cut costs like I did in redesigning these and what I did in establishing the now grow space. I need to put forth the effort and the cost in order to do things right the first time. But yeah, this is the final design that I came up with and then I implemented into the grow space that you will see in future videos, how it looks now. The only thing that's not there is the greenhouse, and I'm still combating weeds, and that's the most challenging thing. But I was always looking for the flow of how to use the space and maximize and grow space. Can I get the amount of crops that I'll need to sell in order to get the proper profit? I exceeded the grow space that I had from the original design with this one. And there is always room for in-ground growing within the greenhouse for overwintering. Now this greenhouse was a model I designed based off of the Hobby Gardener greenhouse from Grower Solutions. They did have a sale on it, but I believe they fixed it and there's not a sale anymore. I designed it to also house a workbench, and in those winter months like December and January when it's time to start peppers, the greenhouse would be much appreciated because I've done peppers indoors and had to store them either in bathrooms or my bedroom in order to get them started and established for outdoor planting. black here is the weed barrier or tarps, because I use tarp. So it would kill the grass of the whole area of the weed barrier or tarp, and then I would outline it and cut out that insert part where the wood framing would go. I would infill with Miracle-Gro or topsoil and then heavily mulch on top with wood chip, and then that would be the overall design of it. But we'll get into in future videos how that wasn't the case and how I started this growing season off with a lot of troubles, a lot of headache, and a lot of doubt.